Good morning, everybody. We have a fascinating topic to discuss this morning, and I will say in preparing for this, we had conversations between Washington, D.C., Montreal, Berlin, and as you'll see, Africa, and I'm saying Africa rather than a specific country, to prepare for this session. It is going to be surprisingly engaging. It's already a great topic, but I learned so many things and destroyed so many of my assumptions about talent recruiting and management. I'm going to ask my three panelists to come on out here and grab a seat. I'm going to quickly frame things. So please welcome Tiaji Sio, Esther Ndjir, and Nina Maturu. So I have the easiest job at this conference today, which is going to be letting them have a conversation about the challenges of building an entrepreneurial state. But I want to frame the problem for you briefly before we get started. A March 2023 poll in the UK says that the country is in a retention and recruiting crisis. Pay is the main concern. 38% of people are 38% of public sector workers are actively considering departing from their jobs or actively looking for a new job. That's over a third of the entire public service. And they cite poor work-life balance, they cite low pay, feeling undervalued, lack of career progression. In the educational field, 1 in 8 qualified teachers will quit their job after a year, and 31% will quit after 5 years. People do not like staying in the public sector. In the US, jobs in local government dropped by about 8.5% during the pandemic, so everybody's now scrambling to hire. But 81% of state and federal and local governments are hiring new people and all facing workforce challenges. 69% of state and local governments said more employees were quitting, and 60% said more were retiring. So we're kind of facing this huge issue where people don't want to work in the public service and they're checking out from a lot of their careers. And then I sort of thought, well, maybe it's not just the public sector, because, I mean, public sector job openings are going up, number of applicants is going way down. In fact, there's a 35% gap between number of positions and number of applicants. And at the current rates, we're going to see a 70% gap between public sector jobs being created and applicants for those jobs. So then I thought, is it just the public sector? And it turns out it's not, at least in the US. 75% of employers are not able to fill job vacancies. The US has a labor shortage of 70%, and in the Netherlands, there are 194 occupations with labor shortages, which is the most in Europe. So people don't want to work. They really don't want to work in local government, and the people who are in local government are kind of checking out. Data would suggest that we are facing a global hiring meltdown, and that it is disproportionately represented in the public sector. As I talked to these two panelists and we got ready for this session, I realized that's a really myopic view of the world, because the answers are nuanced and they vary heavily by geography, but the techniques you need to use to find the best candidates and to keep and retain and make them love their jobs have a lot of common threads. So I'm going to begin by asking our panelists to briefly introduce themselves so you know who you're hearing from, and then we're going to get into how we go about addressing this hiring crisis that's happening in the public sector.
Thank you for having me. My name is Tiaji. I'm actually one of those people that you just talked about. I used to work in the German Foreign Service, and I was a civil servant for life, and I, last December, decided to quit. Now I'm co-leading a new initiative called Reform, which is actually trying to tackle exactly those issues, reforming the state as we find it today, because we believe that the way it's structured today is not fit for the challenges that we're facing. And one of these challenges is actually gaining and retaining talent, the best and the brightest minds for government. And I think this is exactly what is needed. And there are a lot of young people that actually want to work in government, but we need the right structures and the right incentives to make it attractive for them.
And we're definitely going to come back to many of those questions in a minute. So thank you and welcome. Esther?
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Esther Ndagire. I work with the African Union, which is pretty much like the European Union, but for Africa. and it represents the 55 member states on the continent. I am now a program officer, but I initially joined as a tech fellow. And the reason that I decided to join government was because I wanted a career in international development, and I wanted to work on innovation at the scale of the African continent and not just for my country. So we go about this a little bit later, about the recruitment dynamics in Africa and how they differ from what we may know here. But yeah, I'm excited. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nina Maturu. So I'm a design strategist and innovation strategist. So I started my career in community organizing. So I had the opportunity to live around the world, including New York City, Japan, India, and Tanzania. And then I went back to graduate school for business and public policy and moved to the private sector. So helped with building the innovation pipelines for mostly Fortune 50 companies. But I really missed my public sector and nonprofit roots. So came back to government through the White House Presidential Innovation Fellowship, which brings people from the private sector, innovators from the private sector, so think designers, technologists, strategists, and puts them in government for 1 to 2 years to serve as senior advisors to different government agencies. So that's what I'm doing now. And to me, it's a really exciting opportunity. So I guess I'm on the other end, like I'm new to government, because it's the first time I get to bridge my design, my business, and my policy experiences all in one place.
And one of the things I love is that, unlike a lot of discussions on this, we have perspectives from Europe, North America, and Africa. So it's really refreshing to see these different angles, because I learned a lot from all of you about just how different things are. So, Tiaji, you left the German Foreign Service. Can you talk a little bit about why you left and what it was that made you concerned that we were not building an on-ramp for the next generation of public servants?
Sure. I actually had a really exciting position when I left. I was working on human rights policy and humanitarian aid, and it was exactly what I had studied at Harvard, where I studied foreign and security policy. But for me, what really put me off was the bureaucracy and the rigid structures, and an organization where I felt that my talent, that I couldn't really express my talent for making organizational changes. And one of the things that I had done earlier on in my career in the Foreign Office is that I co-created a group called Diplomats of Color, which advocated for more diversity, equity, and inclusion in the German Foreign Service, because I had noticed that this is really an area that previously hadn't really been focused on a lot. And I think this led to a work culture that wasn't really inclusive for everyone, and it wasn't representative of German society, which now has 25% of people with a so-called migration background. And so for me, the reason I left wasn't because I wasn't passionate about foreign policy or because I didn't want to work for government. I did, but it lacked the vision and, for me, the ability to have an impact and to pave the way for future generations to be in an environment where they can truly fulfill their fullest potential.
For sure. So I'm going to remind all the panelists here and all of you, this is a festival, so let's be as communicative as possible. I have many questions I could ask you, but I would love it if I didn't have to say anything. So if either of you wants to lean in and ask a question about what the others are saying, please have that conversation. It'll be better for all of us. I don't want to be throwing a question at one of you while the other two waits. So I will say, Esther, what is your sense of representation in, obviously if Tiaji was feeling so that there was such a disconnect between the employees and the representation of government, and you obviously started things on like decolonializing the public sector and so, which is fascinating. You come from a world where that's not really the issue, right? So how is that different from Tiaji's experience, Esther?
So again, I'm going to recollect my thoughts. The African Union has 55 member states, and it takes very careful approaches to make sure that all the 55 member states are represented. There's a recruitment criteria, it makes sure that everyone is evenly represented. So in terms of diversity in that perspective, it is doing okay. There was a challenge, though, that now is being addressed. There was not enough women and not enough youth, or people who identify as women and youth, right? And now the African Union has gone through the extra effort to make sure that there are slots dedicated to women, and there are also slots dedicated to youth, and to make sure that we are achieving that parity. Now, I do relate to Tiaji. You do get into the system, and it is a bit frustrating. There are so many bureaucratic structures, and for me, I come from the African context, and there is lots of hierarchies and, people who are like the foundational fathers of the African Union, and they deserve the respect that, you must give them. And sometimes coming in as a young person, especially me who came in from private sector, it's a lot to navigate. We've come in to innovate, to disrupt, to improve the processes. And sometimes you get stuck in the processes, trying to figure out your feet as a young person and as a woman. How do you approach a system that was, primarily patriarchal and, primarily also gives respect to age? How do you navigate that? So I find that those frustrations, in a way, are similar to yours, but also different given the African context. So it's not about, it's not about nationality. Everyone is evenly represented, but it's about how you navigate the system. I think we're having a discussion about this. How do you draft emails? How do you talk to people? Are you giving them all the protocols that they observe, that you need to observe, and that sort of thing? And so when there is that, and you need to navigate that, it makes innovation and disruption frustrating, because you're navigating the papers, the words behind the words, the subliminals, that you're not getting down to what needs to be done. But I must say that my fellowship is similar to yours. They brought in people with innovation backgrounds, techies to disrupt, and I feel like there's been a certain level of success that we could talk about a little later, but I'm going to throw it to you, Nina, on your thoughts on diversity and kind of like navigating that.
Yeah, well, so, I feel like we're talking about hiring, and tell me if I'm steering it in a different direction. But when you're talking about bureaucracy, right, like that is, certainly it's the name of this festival, that's what we think about when we think of government. But I found like surprisingly, I thought going into it, I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna like government. Let me just try it for a year and see what happens. But what I was surprised is the team that I am on is like the structure of the team has allowed me to navigate bureaucracy more comfortably than I thought I would. So I've worked in big bureaucratic organizations. I worked at American Express, and it's a huge organization. But what's interesting about team structure that I think there's a potential opportunity is someone who knows the system. Someone who knows the communication. They know all the different contracting and procurement systems. But then you have people of different backgrounds. So then you have a big idea, and you have all of these different skill sets to make it happen. And I feel like that's something that we're lacking. We always we want someone who's done X, Y, and Z, and exactly how we do it here, instead of bringing people of different backgrounds and being like, okay, we're all trying to solve the same problem. Maybe we have different ways of going about it, and let's help each other get to that yes. And so I wonder, what made you want to leave government? What if you had gotten the right team of people? Or maybe there's somebody who likes all that bureaucracy hacking, right? And how do we put them together so that we can achieve these bigger goals?
Yeah, and maybe adding on to exactly what you said, this is why I'm so excited about government, because I see that there's so much potential and there are so many pockets of opportunities. And through my role now, where I'm in touch with government officials from the federal, state, and local levels, I see that throughout our network, there are so many people that actually have this shared mission and the shared vision, and that are willing to disrupt the hierarchy and the bureaucracy. And so I see now that I can kind of zoom out and have a bigger picture of German bureaucracies. I see that there are these pockets of innovation, and I feel like these are kind of like best practices that can be applied to different levels and different parts of the bureaucracy or the government. And I also think that this is something that needs to be done, because the people working in the administrations, they know exactly what the challenges are. They know exactly who to talk to, what language to speak. And so they have this organizational knowledge, and if they can combine the organizational knowledge with the idea of innovative thought and of, okay, how can we work on this shared mission together, and maybe use methods and tools that we haven't tried out yet, I think this is really where I see the potential and why I'm so excited to be now supporting governments to do this type of work and potentially returning to government at some point. But yeah.
So have you seen examples of that have been successful, like this teaming of someone who knows the system versus someone maybe from the outside who has a fresh perspective?
To come together, you mean? Or, honestly, I feel like, there are some programs like Work for Germany that does this, where they bring in fellows to join federal agencies. There's an organization called Lokalprojekte that does this on a local level in Germany. So we can see that there are initiatives that already do this type of work. But I think what a big difference is compared to the US is that it's not very institutionalized yet, and it always depends on individuals or individual departments to be taken in these people. And I think there's a huge opportunity here for governments to actually make this their own and to proactively seek out talent and fellows. And it doesn't necessarily only need to be people from the private sector that come in for a short time, but what about hiring somebody for a specific project and having them be part of the organization instead of in an advisory role. So I feel like there are lots of opportunities there.
Can I just ask, we had a conversation yesterday, and one of the people I was speaking with from Singapore said that there used to be this stigma that if you left government, you were never coming back. You've quit. How dare you? And they've changed the model there so you can go into the private sector and back into the public sector. There are some structural reasons for this. When you're in Singapore, the government employees get paid roughly 90% of what a private sector employee would get, and they don't have a pension. But everybody in Singapore, public and private, has mandatory retirement savings. So structurally, they changed things. They said we know public service is a calling, so we don't want to pay it dramatically more because that looks like corruption, and we also don't want to pay it dramatically less. They said pay it 90% of what you'd get in the private sector, and because there's no pension that you're sort of trying to stick around for. And he said it completely changed the nature of like the stigma of going in and out like that. The thing that I found staggering when talking to you is the vast difference in recruiting numbers. I mean, US, we have a public sector hiring number, but Esther, you said some absolutely staggering things about the number of employees. I'm just going to quote one and I'll let you talk about the rest. The AU Tech Fellowship, the first time, had how many applicants?
So the first cohort had 700 applicants.
And how many positions?
13.
And then the next cohort had?
3,192.
And how many positions?
They're going to take only 17.
So that's a surplus. You don't have a problem with the pipeline. What is the challenge when you have that many applicants?
There's definitely a supply issue on the African context. So the Tech Fellowship is relatively new. I was in the first cohort, and there's a call for a second cohort, and we can see how the numbers are rising. But there is an older program called the African Union Youth Volunteer Corps. So you basically join the African Union for about a year or two and, volunteer with the different departments. There is a stipend. It's modest, but they receive anything from 10,000 to even 40,000. I asked after our call. There is a cohort that received 40,000 applications, and they only take 100. So in Africa, it's a supply issue. And this is not your average, mediocre, let me just apply and see if I get in. These are competitive. It's all the way from, do you have a master's degree and like 3 years experience? It's competitive. So there's definitely a supply issue. And so for us, it becomes a bit about job security. Not entirely, but a bit about it. If I can get in and secure a role, I would work for government. I'll work for anybody who will give me a job, because then I'm not part of the 40,000 who don't have a job. But beyond that, I mean, I joined because I'm very passionate about innovation. I had briefly worked for the UNFPA. I enjoyed it. And when the Tech Fellowship opened for innovation at this level, I was like, brilliant. I get to work from the perspective of 55 states. How do you program for people who are, the most diverse continent, 55, every country having maybe 100 languages, very nuanced. At the African Union, we only recognize 6 languages, but every country where I come from, there are about 60 languages, and that's a very small country. So how do you program for such people? What is innovation from that perspective? That's why I joined, but I had to go through a very rigorous process. The lady who recruited me is right over there. She can tell you how cutthroat it is. But so when supply is an issue, sometimes there's a bit of governments are not very, come in or don't come. Like, there's always going to be space. So there's a bit of reluctance to be intentional about making, it attractive for talent. But through this fellowship and the different programs that we have, I believe that there is steps in the right direction. For example, the fellowship I'm on is very unique because it's bringing together the innovation ecosystem of Africa, private sector, and government to make sure that they're getting this really good talent that can go and support innovation. So, I mean, for us, we could get into the numbers. I have a ton of them here, but I won't bore you with them. But yeah, there's a lot of talent, and it's very competitive, which means recruiters, even in private sector, are less, intentional about making it attractive. But I do want to say that there is a bit of progress being made on the continent to attract good talent that can further the development of the continent. Do you want to come in on your recruitment dynamics or how it is here? Is it supply-driven or demand-driven, or what determines how people make the choice to join government?
Yeah, it's so interesting listening to you, because it's almost like the exact opposite, where in Germany we have such a shortage of, of skilled workers in all sectors, but especially the public sector is really now at a point where they really have to make, tough decisions on how to become more attractive, because young people have choices. They can choose to go into any other workplace, so any employer kind of has to make themselves more attractive and go with the times, kind of, especially with a new generation coming in that also have different expectations towards their workplaces. And so I feel like, it's so interesting hearing what you're saying, but at the same time, we also need I feel like government needs to attract the best talent and needs to have processes in place that ensures that people with the right competencies come in test for the right skills that are needed for an innovative state. And what I mean by that, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you studied law, that you're automatically the best fit for a government position, but that other skills such as, are you somebody that can think outside of the box? Are you somebody that knows how to navigate a system? Are you somebody that can, if you're aspiring, for example, a leadership position, that can rally people and that can motivate people? Mm-hmm. And I feel like these soft skills are really becoming hard skills, because they're essentially needed for all forms of government levels.
And Nina, you're a designer, and I mean, to break apart the title of this session, it's attracting and keeping great people. That word "great" is doing a lot of work. What's a great person, right? Someone who's representative of a population, somebody who, in a competitive environment, stands out. If you've got 40,000 people with master's degrees, you've still got to get a good criteria for great. And obviously the innovation programs that you've been in, like the Presidential Innovation Fellows, have screening processes. I'd love to hear from each of you if you could define one criteria that you're looking for in a candidate to make your respective organizations entrepreneurial in the next 10 years, what is that thing you're testing for that's not currently on the hiring requirements?
Oh, I have to pick one.
Well, you can pick some.
Okay,
Well, it's
okay.
your panel.
I guess I would look for certain behaviors rather than skills, which is kind of what you're speaking about. So there's two that I've found really important. The first is self-awareness. Most people are not that self-aware. And you need someone who's self-aware, because then you don't have to tell them when they messed up. They already know, and they want to get better. They want feedback to get better. And as a designer, I think one of the things one of the tools that we use is a lot of first-hand interviews, or design research to build empathy with end users. And you have to be, as a designer, aware of your own biases and your own lenses in which you see the world in order to be able to write objective insights. You have to be like, well, I grew up like this, so I probably see things like this. And I think that has been, for me, I ran my own business before joining this fellowship, and that was always the #1 dictator of success. Like, if I could ask something like that, and they had done some self-reflection. The other thing is, when we're in meetings and we're in conversation, there is this behavior that I call greenhousing. So I'm going to go into professorial mode for a second. But what's a greenhouse, right? A greenhouse protects a little seedling. So when you have an idea, and it's a new idea, it doesn't have roots yet. And so you need a greenhouse to protect it. And so many times when someone presents a new idea, people are like, no, this is why it's going to go wrong. There's no way, blah, blah, blah. But it's we haven't even built it out. And so you want people who are going to use, are going to suspend judgment. They're going to understand and nurture it. And so we use the acronym, I used to use the acronym SUN, a green and a new seedling needs sun. And so people who do that often come with curiosity. So tell me more about that. How would that work? And then, as a team, you can build it together. And we always use all these innovation words of learning mindset and all these things. But to me, that's an actual behavior that I see in people that signals to me this is someone who would be a really great member of our team.
Do you have any tricks for, is there, it sounds cheesy to say it, but is there an interview question, or do you do something in meeting new candidates to try and get them to reveal whether they are self-aware and things like that?
I hope they don't listen to this later, but maybe they'll be good, because then they've done research. So sometimes I remember I was, the third thing, so there's a couple things I do. First is I send the interview questions ahead of time. And then, when we talk, if they haven't prepared, I was like, oh, they're probably not going to be a very good employee, because I gave you the questions ahead of time and you didn't do your work. So, you're probably not going to do your work on a day-to-day basis. And then I ask a question on what are the different lenses in which you view the world. I remember I interviewed a woman once, and I asked her, if I were to, we were in New York City, I was like, if I were to stop you on the corner in New York City, what would you say you do? And New Yorkers move fast, so it's a very short, pithy thing. And she went on for 20 minutes in this description. And I said at the end, oh, you do that at the side of, at the corner of the street? And she was like, oh, no, you would have walked away by now. And I thought, oh, this person is self-aware. She could laugh at herself in this moment. And she ended up being one of my best employees, right? So the ability to be take that feedback and not take yourself so seriously was great. And then in terms of the greenhousing, in an interview, if they ask questions, I always also leave time to just talk. And if they ask follow-up questions about things oh, I wonder why somebody did that, or that's really fascinating, it made me think about this. Those to me are signals as well.
So indications of curiosity of some kind. Awesome. I'm taking some notes so we can share people with this at the end. These are great ideas. Esther, tell me about a skill that your organization is not currently looking for, which you wish you would be interviewing for, to find the kinds of entrepreneurial people that will help you survive the next 10 years.
I think the ability to be, especially as a young person, the ability to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations. And be able to thrive in discomfort. I think, especially when you're coming in from private sector, this is like you're very comfortable with this, you know how to navigate the system, and you're going into government, and the nuances are very different. And you're smart, you're brilliant, you know how to innovate, but there are very, very, very many uncomfortable situations that you have to like always be ahead of. So I think for
Do you
me...
mean, sorry to interrupt you, but do you mean uncomfortable like men are interrupting you like I just did? Or do you mean uncomfortable like I can't get things done and I'm used to having them done? Or do you mean uncomfortable like this is a higher degree of uncertainty? Like is the discomfort something where you're compensating for the organization sucking? Or is the discomfort something that's inherent to the job?
I would say inherent to the job. It's not, well, I mean, it could be many things. It could be you now work with people from 55 cultures. Maybe I interrupt you and it's okay for me, or maybe I don't, or maybe I work differently, or maybe I come from a culture where we yell at women, and I'm a woman, and I have to report to you, but you're yelling at me, and you're my supervisor. You have to be comfortable with that. I mean, these are the nuances we have to deal with. Maybe I come from a culture where we don't think women should even be at the workplace at all, and here I am, younger than you, advising you on innovation. You know, so you have to be comfortable with these situations and thrive through them. So for me, I think this is something I think the African Union should look out more, because I mean they recruit brilliant people, like this is given, but many people go in and you know somehow they can't. How to test for that? I don't know.
Just yell at the candidates.
yell at the candidate. You shouldn't be here, and see how they respond.
I mean, I'm uncomfortable with your answer because it sounds like you're compensating for things that shouldn't exist. I think it's pragmatic, right? But you shouldn't go to a job and have someone yell at you. But I guess your point is if you can't handle that, you're going to quit.
Yeah.
So it does sound like these are, if you sort of take Maslow's hierarchy, this is like low on the hierarchy, is like tolerate the horrible organization is a criteria for, are you the kind of person that can deal with getting yelled at and treated badly? Because if so, you should apply. That's a terrible job description, but I understand the pragmatism if you're facing these cultural issues, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, I mean, discomfort, that's very pragmatic.
Yeah.
I don't like the fact that you need to have that as a criteria, but it's a good one. And now if Esther yells at you in an interview, we know why. I'm kidding. Is there anything else that's not sort of compensating for the inadequacies of the system, but rather thinking about the future, or like a personality trait that will allow them to adapt better or think in a designing way or something like that you'd like to see?
I think I would concur with Nina, and I don't want to go into that. I think you need to have a curious mindset. You need to question some processes, and you need to be willing to incubate your idea, even in the context of government, and make sure that you can get some eyelids for it and grow it and nurture it and test and see if it works. And I think this is the whole point of the fellowship that I was on. Are you able to stand by your idea, grow it, nurture it, and then launch it and get feedback? So I think curiosity in innovation in general, especially in government, is a key skill that you need.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, and what would you like to see?
Actually, I would like to maybe turn what you said into this more future-oriented thinking. Holding discomfort, I feel like, and this is just bringing in my example, when we first founded Diplomats of Color, a lot of people in the Foreign Office weren't happy with it at all. People were questioning, like, why do we even need this? People were, especially men, were scared. Oh, they're trying to get ahead, or they're just doing it for like selfish reasons. There was a lot of negativity, and there was also a lot of pressure from outside. I faced like social media shitstorms and negative press, and for something that I did internally within the organization. And so I think that was a moment where I had to persevere and sit through the discomfort, and really also be very firm in my conviction that if government doesn't adapt to modern times and doesn't address the 25% of people who have a migration background, then they will not be ready for the future. And thank you. And I was really firm in this belief, and I still am. But this also meant for me personally sitting through this discomfort. And now fast forward to today, we now do have a diversity strategy in the Foreign Office. There's a department that's responsible for equity and inclusion. Just last week, there was a book published on the colonial history of the Foreign Office. And there are so many initiatives still going on with the team that is still tirelessly working on this. And I feel like it really paid off to sit through the discomfort if you also want to make an organizational change. And I think this is really what is needed if an entrepreneurial mindset is valued within government. I think this is just a really good example of what can happen and how positively it can impact an organization.
So what I'm hearing here is, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I also wanted to just build on this this idea of discomfort because my experience is probably more similar to yours, and discomfort is also very tiring. And so that can take away from the actual work that you're doing if you're constantly in an environment where you feel out of place, where you feel like you have to explain things to other people, especially with like different cultural backgrounds, right? And always have to be that educator can be a lot. And I think as we, in a lot of these things that we've talked about, a lot of it's like borrowing things from the private sector and just superimposing it on government. But there's a lot of things the private sector does not do well in this regard, right? And so government is an opportunity. So when you're talking about thinking about the future, in the private sector, you have a specific target market you're going for, and it's like very like specific. But in government, you're serving everybody. That's insane, right? Like everybody's needs, that's so many different types of needs. And so that's an opportunity to build something completely different that is more inclusive, that is more diverse, that's more equitable, and be the example of that.
What I'm taking away from this is that being comfortable in uncomfortable situations is both situations where people are acting badly and you put up with it, tolerate it, and situations where people are acting progressively, and even if you're marginalized personally by that, you have a sense of the bigger picture, and so you're comfortable with the discomfort that comes from change. So change, a willingness to accept change and so on, but also a hard outer shell when you need it, right? So what melts in the middle, hard on the outside, like M&Ms. So we're all making this assumption there is a hiring crisis, and obviously it's very different. In some cases you have excessive supply, in other cases you have limited supply, in other cases you have people who just don't think government is for them. Does the 25% with migrant backgrounds think that a career in public service is a possibility for them, or do they self-disqualify?
I think a lot of times they self-disqualify, and I hear this a lot from people that even now I still get direct messages or emails from people who are telling me, I only applied for a job in the Foreign Office or in another government institution because I saw an interview of you in the newspaper, or because I saw your picture on social media. And to me, this is mind-blowing because this is something that kind of was created through just a small initiative, and that has such a big impact on people. And I feel like the government could actually use this proactively. They could proactively pinpoint people that might be interested, but that don't have the government as that don't have in mind that this could be a potential employer. And so I think this is really a key. Like, how do you address people? And there even, you can have the whole social media and branding campaigns and things like that. But what about creating a headhunting agency, for example, for the government that specifically addresses highly qualified, talented people and writes them, hey, we have a job that really fits to your profile. Would you like to apply? Like, there's a huge opportunity there because young people, and I know this from speaking to my peers, a lot of them are very passionate about social issues. They are members of Fridays for Future, or they are in a political party, or they founded their own nonprofit. And a lot of them do want to serve citizens and want to serve civil society. And I feel like government is the perfect place for them. And so why doesn't the government make use of these talented, driven people and pinpoint them and attract them, and then provide attractive, benefits and an attractive workplace where they can thrive and make use of these skills?
Can I ask a controversial question?
Sure.
When we spoke earlier, you mentioned that your organization, and I want to make sure I say it properly. You mentioned that your organization is actively working to improve the representation. I love this. You said when you got to Berlin, you were shocked by how different the public sector was and how many people had royal names. Does anybody here know what a royal name is?
So maybe that got lost in translation. So in German, you would say Adelstitel, or like you have a von in your name. And there are a lot of people in the Foreign Office and generally in government who come from the small part of society that belong to this group. And that's just to exemplify how there's a small group in society that's very overrepresented compared to 25% with a migrant background who are currently not represented adequately, especially not the higher you look up the hierarchy. And I think this is not just coincidental, but actually an example or just a manifestation of a structural issue.
Sure.
And I think this also leads to kind of, when you look at what questions are being asked, for example, when you apply for a government job, a lot of the knowledge you need is implicit knowledge that you learn through how you grew up and what social class you grew up in. And I feel like this is a bias that can easily be taken out of the equation and be taken out of the selection process when you want to make governments more inclusive and representative of all social classes, all backgrounds, people with disabilities, like all these different things, people with different, who are not just lawyers, but also who studied, I don't know, history or so.
You said, 2 years master's in an economic thesis, qualifications if you studied abroad, all those kinds of things, right? So if you're trying to bring in the best candidates and you're able to choose from a bigger pool of candidates, it follows that you're going to get better candidates. But if your system for recruiting precludes candidates that might be entrepreneurial because it's based on what a good candidate looked like years ago, that seems very problematic. So how would you change the qualifications in your different fields? How would each of you change the qualifications and the recruiting, interview, hiring process to bring in a broader range of candidates so that we're not hiring people that look like the past, but hiring people who can handle the future? So what would you change?
I think there are different ways to look at this. I think one thing is to really eliminate pictures, names, and in the first step of the hiring process, and to really just look at what does somebody bring to the table. And I think the other thing that can be done is to critically look at what questions do we ask, and is the question we're asking really indicative of what is actually needed for the job. And I think this can be done in in the private sector, I think there are some really great examples of how this can be done. I think the government should really reconsider. And there are already good examples, but eliminating unconscious bias in the hiring process and testing for skills that are actually needed on the job. I think these are the two criteria, I would say.
Esther?
Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay, brilliant. I think the tech fellowship that I joined on, because it's only 2 years and it went through a very intensive consultative process with the innovation ecosystem, private sector, and the African Union, The recruitment is actually really well done. I would like to argue, I don't know if maybe it's because I got in, I don't know. But they were not only looking at educational background, they were interested in our portfolio. What have you done before? Have pretty much critical thinking, problem solving. This is what they were testing for. So they were not very intensive on how the AU typically hires. So do you have your master's? Do you have your this? And all of that. They were more evidence of critical thinking, design, research skills, and share a portfolio. And you don't have to, you needed some kind of certificate, but not a master's degree. So some kind of higher level certification was fine. But more on the practical side, like, have you designed something? Have you solved a problem? Have you worked with people of different contexts? So I think that that fellowship, it was really well done. I would then recommend that the other programs that the African Union has pick a leaf from how this fellowship was recruited for, so that you have more people with the actual skills that we're talking about, as opposed to looking really good on paper and then just being frustrated when you join the system, yeah.
So I have a near-in and a far-out suggestion. So my near-in is, so for government hiring, in the job description, they'll have core competencies, and you have to make sure that you have that exact phrasing in your resume. Speaking of which, when I applied for this government job, my resume was 15 pages. Like, it was insane, because you have to just say like everything you've done and exactly how you've done it. It was the most exhausting thing I've ever done. It took me so long. You know, but I remember like having to go back and change these words. And I'll give you an example. So as a designer, when I worked in international development and community organizing, we used participatory design. Then I worked in the private sector, and we used design thinking. And now I'm in the public sector, and we use human-centered design. They're all the same thing, but like they have, like, every discipline has their own words for something. And I think it's a real big limitation in government hiring, because you might have someone who has exact skills that you want, but they didn't use the exact right word. And so that's a near-in solution. Could we maybe have, like, for this core competency, like all of these different iterations? Or maybe it's not certain, like not 2 words, but like something else? Or could we use AI to construct more meaning out of what somebody's done? So that's my near-in. And the far out is, I personally think our whole interviewing process needs to be redesigned. I think it never, I mean, does anybody feel like in the audience, like it does a really good job of getting the best candidates? No, like a resume review and an interview about these like fake questions of what might happen or what you've done in the past that people can make up, right? Like you have no way of verifying that. And then you bring them on and then they don't do a good job and you're like, oh, but they were so good in the interview, right? So I don't know what that might look like. But you know, some of the things that I've been thinking about is if we hire based on teams, which as I mentioned before, could we just have a big problem we're trying to solve, and then we ask people, how would you solve it? And they could say, like, they could be, you know, if it's more of like an operations question, you could have people from way different backgrounds trying to solve that problem. I think the issue there is, oftentimes we don't know the problem we're trying to solve, right? And so that would require more work on the interviewer's part. But to me, a manager is not so much someone who is like telling people what to do, but it's like a curator. So I'm going to put a great team of people together, and you guys are brilliant, and you'll figure it out. And then if there's any roadblocks, I will remove them for you.
Sure.
Can I chip in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Because what you said really reminded me of my hiring process for my current role at Reform, and comparing it to my government job. So when I applied for my government job, I was sitting in front of like 10 people sitting in a row, and I was sitting on my own on the front, and they were just asking me questions. Now at Reform, the way they did it with my future team, or with my team that I work with now, we did a workshop. And we had this co-creative process and brainstormed together on how we would solve a certain issue. And so this got us in the mood of how it would be like to then work together. And I feel like this is an idea that if you're hiring somebody for a specific team, for a specific project, you could bring them in and have them do a 1 or 2 hour workshop with them and see, like, does it click and does it fit?
I had a conversation with some folks at Agriculture Canada, and they actually ran a hackathon for students, and then one of the students who won the hackathon got a position in government. But the thing they said is when you're looking for a job, the job description exists. And we go, I have a job, now let's fill it, instead of I have a talented candidate, here's where they might go. So their whole pipeline was run these hackathons to find talented candidates, because if the person doesn't necessarily match the job description, but they could fit in that role, now you can take from that pool. So there really is a myopia of we start with a box and we find people that fit in the box, instead of we start with people and then we figure out which boxes they might be good in. Just as a way of, and many of these systems were set up sort of bureaucratically to ensure that those roles were unionized and standardized and stuff. We are out of time, but I want to give you a very quick 30 seconds each. What is the thing that is going to, if we were having this conversation in 10 years, what is the thing that we would be talking about the most that we haven't talked about so far? Like pretend we're fast forward 10 years. You know, if we were, I was talking to some I'll give you time to think. I was talking to some diplomats a while ago, and one of them said to me, what do you think is the biggest change in the Foreign Service? And I said, WhatsApp. She said, yeah, it's totally, like it's completely changed the Foreign Service. It gives you back channels and all, pre-Meta acquiring them. What's the thing that we're not talking about that's going to change the world in the next 10 years that would make some of our questions or comments irrelevant? And how do we think about it?
I mean, to me, the elephant in the room is artificial intelligence and how a lot of these administrative procedures that are just standardized, how they can be easily be supported through AI. And I would be so curious to see in 10 years how government embraces it and how at the same time they can ensure that it's safe and that data is protected at the same time, but just make structures more efficient.
Esther?
So in 10 years, or even less, in 10 years, the African continent will be supplying half of the workforce. Currently, I believe 70% of the continent is below the age of 35.
Wow.
So in 10 years, we're going to be supplying a lot of the workforce. I would like for African governments to take this a bit more seriously and prepare the people who are going to supply the global workforce to be competitive at that level. So maybe in 10 years we meet and discuss how almost everyone will be, recruiting an African person and how that looks like and how our governments have prepared for that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we're moving towards more like decentralized knowledge systems in general. And so I think current hiring is more about finding one candidate with everything. And sometimes it feels nearly impossible when you look at the job descriptions. And so I think in the future, it'll be more, we'll be looking more for like orchestrators or connectors and people who can bring people together quickly and then disperse them. And that's how we'll go about acquiring knowledge and making decisions.
Those are three really good things I wish we had more time to talk about, so maybe next year. Thank you all so much. Thank you for attending. Great conversation.